In this movie, we're going to be discussing web color models. As a web designer, it's very important that you understand these models so that as you work with different developers and/or pieces of software and code, you know exactly how to represent color correctly and how to translate color values that might be given to you in a variety of different formats. Undoubtedly, if you're a designer, you already know about the RGB color space, which stands for red, green, and blue. What you may not be aware of, however, is that standard RGB color can be represented in code form several different ways. The first of which is something called a hex code. You should basically think of a hex code as a 6-digit string that represents RGB color in a concise, code-level manner. Here are some of the more common hex codes you might run into and the colors that are created by them. For instance, in order to create black, you would type out a pound sign and 6 zeros. For white, you would have a pound sign and 6 letter Fs. For red, you would have a pound sign, 2 Fs, and 4 zeros. But what do all those values really mean? Well, to make sense of a hex code, let's break it down piece by piece. The first portion of a hex code is, of course, the pound sign, which declares that this is indeed a hex value. The other 6 characters are 3 pairs of either 0 through 9 or A through F values. Each pair controls one primary color, red, green, and blue. The higher the numbers, the brighter the color. In our example here, red is the dominant color over the other 2, and thus the resulting color would be something like this. In order to achieve values greater than 99 in a hex code, you will use the letters A through F, with F being the full saturation of a color, or an RGB value of 255. So in this next example, where I have 0 for the red value, FF for the green value, and 00 for the blue value, we would get an ultra-saturated green color as a result that looks something like this. While some of the more common hex codes can be easy to remember, it's next to impossible to remember them all. Luckily, though, Photoshop has a built-in hex translation in its color picker. As you can see on your screen right here, that little box that I have circled on screen shows you where the hex code is. So you would just go in and mix colors as you normally would, and that will automatically generate the hex code values for you that you can then enter into your code or simply pass them off to a developer once the coding process is started. In addition to hex code values, there's also RGB and RGBA values that you have to contend with on the web in CSS as well. RGBA is quickly becoming one of the more popular models because of its added ability to control the A or alpha value of a color, which basically means you're controlling the transparency of that color. So, for example, let's jump over into Photoshop here, and as you can see, I've got this square on my screen. It's completely red, and it's got a layer opacity of 75%. In order to translate that properly into a color code that I can use in CSS, let's say, I would actually need to tell my developer that this box needed an RGBA value of 255.00.75. That means we have full power for the red, 255. We have 0 for the green and blue because there's neither one of those colors present. And then we have 75% opacity for the fill itself. Now, as you can see, these color models really aren't that difficult to decipher once you understand all the little bits and pieces that make them work. But I get it. That can be a little intimidating at first, especially when you're seeing all of this code and all that stuff in front of you. My suggestion to understand all of this is really simple. First and foremost, pay attention to the hex codes as you're mixing colors inside of Photoshop. It'll automatically be generated as you move the color picker around and change RGB values. That way you can easily learn and translate that into your own designs. Also, learn how to read alternate color methods like RGBA, so that when and if a developer hands you something with a value that has RGBA values in it, you can easily put that into play in a design in Photoshop or even another application like Illustrator or InDesign. Also, never be afraid to ask a developer for help. The designer-developer relationship only works if communication is great between both parties. You need to understand them just like they need to be able to understand you. Okay, hopefully I've given you the basic knowledge you need to understand these web color models. And now you should be ready to begin working with color a little bit more efficiently in your web design workflow and Photoshop as well. So, my friend, go forth and color.